The late afternoon sun bathed Waterfront Park in a warm, golden glow, casting long shadows over the cobblestone paths and the iconic fountain at its heart. Simon Caldwell adjusted his tailored blazer as he strolled down the familiar streets of Charleston, his steps purposeful yet unhurried. The scent of blooming jasmine mixed with the salty tang of the harbor breeze, evoking a nostalgia he hadn't felt in years. This city held so many memories, some cherished, some painful. But today, he had come back not for sentiment, but to scout potential properties for his expanding real estate empire. Pausing near the fountain, Simon gazed at the water cascading rhythmically over its tiers. For a fleeting moment, he was transported to a simpler time, a time when he and his younger sister would race each other down these very paths. Her laughter echoed in his mind like a ghostly refrain, tugging at emotions he had long buried. He shook his head slightly, dispelling the thought, and turned to continue his walk. That's when he saw them. A soccer ball rolled across the grass, coming to a stop near his polished leather shoes. Two children, a boy and a girl, perhaps 7 or 8, chased after it, their laughter ringing out over the park's gentle hum. Simon instinctively bent down, picking up the ball. As he straightened, his eyes locked on the boy's face, and a strange, inexplicable sensation washed over him. The child's features, a sharp jawline, a dimple on the left cheek, a certain intensity in his gaze, were startlingly familiar. Simon's eyes darted to the girl who was now clutching her brother's arm. Her wavy chestnut hair shimmered in the light, and the way she tilted her head, curious but cautious, struck him with a peculiar sense of recognition. "Thanks, mister," the boy said, his grin wide as he reached for the ball. Simon hesitated before handing it over. "You're welcome," he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil brewing inside. "Jacob, come on." The girl tugged at her brother's arm, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Mom's waiting." Okay, Julia." Jacob laughed, dribbling the ball between his feet as the pair ran off toward a nearby bench where a woman sat watching. Simon's gaze followed them, his breath catching as he took in the woman's presence. She was dressed simply in a pale sundress, her posture poised but not rigid. Her wavy hair mirrored the girl's, framing a face etched with strength and gentleness. She called out to the children, her voice carrying a warm authority that immediately drew them to her side. Simon lingered a moment longer, watching the family dynamic unfold. There was something deeply compelling, almost magnetic about the scene, something that tugged at his subconscious, whispering of connections he couldn't yet articulate. As if sensing his eyes on her, the woman turned briefly in his direction, her gaze meeting his for a split second. Her brow furrowed slightly before she turned her attention back to the children. Simon exhaled sharply and tore his gaze away. His pulse inexplicably quickened. Forcing his feet to move, he walked toward the edge of the park, the sense of unease lingering like a shadow. He didn't look back, but the image of those two children and their mother was seared into his memory. Simon's mind churned as he left the park, his usually sharp focus clouded by the encounter. He rarely allowed himself to dwell on anything outside his carefully managed world of business deals and strategic acquisitions, but something about the children gnawed at him. Their faces, their expressions, it wasn't just their resemblance to each other that struck him. It was their resemblance to him. The thought was absurd, almost laughable, and yet, as he strolled toward the parking lot, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that had taken root. His chest tightened as memories surfaced from a chapter of his life he had long since closed. Years ago, struggling to make ends meet as a fresh college graduate, he had made a decision that, at the time, seemed insignificant, a practical solution to a financial problem. He had donated to a fertility clinic. It had been transactional, sterile, and entirely impersonal. Simon had barely thought about it since, dismissing the act as nothing more than a youthful misstep in the face of temporary hardship. But now, standing under the Charleston sun with the images of those children imprinted in his mind, he found himself revisiting that choice with growing unease. Could it be possible? No, it was too far-fetched. Coincidences happened all the time. Sliding into the leather seat of his car, Simon tapped his fingers against the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The logical part of him screamed to let it go, to move on and chalk up the similarity to imagination or chance. But another part, the part that had noticed the unmistakable familiarity in the boy's sharp jawline, the girl's inquisitive gaze, refused to relent. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a familiar contact. Ricardo Sanchez. Ricardo wasn't just his business partner, he was also his closest confidant, a grounding force in Simon's life. If anyone could help him think through this objectively, it was Ricardo. As the phone rang, Simon drummed his fingers impatiently on the console. "Simon," came Ricardo's voice, smooth and assured as always. "What's going on? I thought you were taking the afternoon off." "I was," Simon replied, glancing back toward the park, now a speck in the distance. "Something strange happened." Ricardo's laugh was low and easy. "Strange? That doesn't sound like you. What is it? A bad investment? Someone outbid you on a property?" "No," Simon said, his tone more serious than he intended. "It's personal." The shift in Simon's voice was enough to silence Ricardo's playful tone. "All right," Ricardo said after a pause. "Tell me." Simon hesitated, the weight of the words hanging in the air before he spoke. "I saw 2 kids today. In the park. They looked like me." There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by Ricardo's incredulous chuckle. "What? Come on, Simon. What are you talking about?" "I'm not joking," Simon insisted. "I mean it. They looked too much like me for it to be a coincidence. And their mother—" He stopped, realizing how ridiculous it all sounded when said aloud. "Never mind. Maybe I'm imagining things." "Hold on," Ricardo interjected, his tone now serious. "This isn't like you. You don't just imagine things. Tell me everything." Simon relayed the events in detail, from the soccer ball rolling to his feet to the fleeting eye contact with the woman who called the children away. He spoke cautiously, choosing his words carefully, but even as he explained, he could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. When he finished, Ricardo let out a low whistle. "That's unexpected. But Simon, kids who look like you, that's a hell of a leap." "I know," Simon admitted, "but there's something unsettling about it. I can't explain it." "All right," Ricardo said after a thoughtful pause. "You're a logical guy. Start there. You've got resources. If this is eating at you, find out the truth. But tread carefully, Simon. You don't want to open a door you're not ready to walk through." Simon leaned back in his seat, Ricardo's words echoing in his mind. Find out the truth. As absurd as it seemed, he couldn't ignore the gnawing curiosity. Or was it something more? Responsibility? He wasn't sure yet. "Thanks, Ricardo," Simon said finally. "I'll let you know what I find." Ending the call, Simon stared out at the setting sun. The park was out of sight now, but its memory lingered. His instincts, honed from years of reading markets and people, told him there was more to this than a passing resemblance, and if Ricardo was right, the only way to quiet his thoughts was to uncover the truth. Simon placed his phone down, a decision forming in his mind. Tomorrow he would make a call, not to Ricardo, but to someone who could give him the answers he sought. For better or worse, he needed to know. Simon woke early the next morning, his thoughts still tangled with the events from the previous day. The children's faces lingered in his mind, stubborn and vivid, refusing to fade, no matter how much he tried to rationalize them away. He paced his sleek apartment, the Charleston skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The light of dawn cast long shadows, reflecting the restless state of his mind. Finally, unable to ignore the pull of his curiosity any longer, Simon picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His thumb hovered for a moment before he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Low Country Investigations. "This is Bradley Green," answered a voice on the other end, calm and professional. "Bradley, it's Simon Caldwell," Simon said, his tone brisk but controlled. "I need your help." There was a slight pause before Bradley replied. "Simon, been a while. I take it this isn't a social call?" "It's not," Simon admitted. "I need you to look into something, quietly." "Go on," Bradley encouraged, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone ready to solve a puzzle. Simon hesitated for a moment. The idea of putting this vague suspicion into words felt absurd, even to him. But he pushed through, recounting the previous day's encounter with the children and their mother. He emphasized the uncanny resemblance, his gut instinct that something about the situation wasn't a coincidence. When he finished, Bradley let out a low hum. "Interesting. You're sure about the timing? About the connection?" "I'm not sure about anything yet," Simon admitted. "But I need answers, and I trust you to be discreet." "Understood," Bradley said. "Give me a couple of days. I'll start with the mother. Layla Whitmore, you said? I'll dig into her background, see what I can find." Simon nodded, though Bradley couldn't see him. "Keep me updated, and Bradley, no one else can know about this." "Not yet." "You have my word," Bradley assured him, before the call ended. Simon exhaled deeply, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he placed the phone on the counter. He wasn't sure if he felt relief or apprehension, knowing the investigation was underway. Part of him wanted to let it go, to walk away, before he uncovered something he wasn't ready to face. But another part, the one that had kept him awake through the night, knew he couldn't stop now. By mid-morning, Simon had buried himself in work, throwing his focus into meetings and negotiations to keep his mind occupied. But even as he reviewed financial reports and discussed property acquisitions, his thoughts drifted back to the park, to the boy's sharp jawline and the girl's inquisitive eyes. He tapped his pen against the desk, annoyed with himself for being so distracted. A knock at his office door pulled him back to the present. Ricardo stepped inside, his usual easy-going demeanor tempered by a hint of concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Ricardo said, settling into the chair across from Simon's desk. "What's going on?" Simon hesitated. He trusted Ricardo implicitly, but this felt too personal, too unresolved to share just yet. "Just a lot on my mind," he said vaguely. "The usual." Ricardo raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Simon, come on. I know you better than that. This isn't about work, is it?" Before Simon could respond, his phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen, an unknown number. His heart skipped a beat as he reached for the phone, a flicker of both anticipation and dread passing through him. "Excuse me," Simon said to Ricardo, holding up a hand as he answered the call. "This is Simon." "Simon, it's Bradley," the investigator said, his tone clipped and businesslike. "I've got some preliminary information for you. It's not much yet, but it's a start." Simon leaned back in his chair, his grip tightening around the phone. "What did you find?" "Layla Whitmore," Bradley began. "Single mother, works at a community center in Charleston. She's been there for years, seems well respected, involved in a lot of local outreach programs. No significant red flags in her personal history so far. As for the kids, Jacob and Julia, they're 7 years old." Simon's breath caught for a moment. 7 years. That timeline fit too perfectly to ignore. Bradley continued, unaware of Simon's reaction. I've confirmed they go to a nearby public school. Nothing unusual there. Their records show their father as unknown. Layla never listed anyone on their birth certificates. Simon exhaled slowly, a mix of relief and unease washing over him. And the clinic? Did you check there yet? That's going to take a little more time, Bradley admitted. I'll need to dig through old records, which isn't exactly straightforward. But I'll get there. Do it, Simon said firmly. I need to know everything about her, the kids, and the connection if there is one. You got it, Bradley replied. I'll be in touch. The line went dead, leaving Simon alone with his thoughts. 7 years. He turned the number over in his mind, the pieces falling into place with unnerving clarity. If Jacob and Julia really were his children, then what? What did he owe them? What did he owe Layla? A sharp knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Ricardo stood there, arms crossed, his expression serious. All right, he said, closing the door behind him. Enough of the cryptic phone calls. What's going on, Simon? Simon hesitated, then gestured for Ricardo to sit. It's complicated, he began, rubbing his temples. I think I might have 2 kids. Ricardo blinked, his expression shifting from confusion to shock. 2 kids? Are you serious? Simon, that's not exactly something you think. Either you do or you don't. Simon explained the events of the previous day, the encounter at the park, the resemblance that had shaken him, and his decision to hire Bradley. As he spoke, Ricardo's initial shock gave way to a mix of curiosity and concern. And you're sure about this? Ricardo asked when Simon finished. The timeline, the resemblance, it's a lot to go on. I'm not sure about anything yet, Simon admitted. But if there's even a chance, I need to know. Ricardo studied him for a moment before nodding. All right. But Simon, you need to think about what you're getting into here. If this is real, it's not just about you anymore. It's about them. I know, Simon said quietly. That's why I can't ignore it. Ricardo leaned back, crossing his arms. Well, I hope you're ready, because if you're right, this could change everything. Simon nodded, his gaze drifting toward the window. He didn't need Ricardo to tell him that. His life was built on control, on calculated risks and careful decisions. But this was something else entirely. For the first time in years, he felt the ground shifting beneath him, the certainty he had always relied on slipping away. As Ricardo left, Simon picked up his phone again, staring at the blank screen. The weight of what he had set in motion pressed down on him, heavy and unrelenting. But beneath the uncertainty, there was something else, a flicker of hope, fragile but unmistakable. If Jacob and Julia were his, then maybe, just maybe, he had a chance to rewrite the story of his life, and he wasn't going to let fear stop him from finding out. The morning light filtered through the windows of the small but welcoming community centre, casting warm rays onto the bustling activity within. Layla Whitmore moved with practiced efficiency, her voice steady as she directed volunteers to their tasks. The annual fundraiser gala was less than a month away, and every detail had to be perfect. The event wasn't just about maintaining the centre's operations, it was about preserving a sanctuary for the families who depended on it. Melissa, could you double-check the table assignments? Layla asked, handing a clipboard to her trusted colleague. We can't afford to miss any donors. Already on it, Melissa replied with a reassuring smile. You've got this, Layla. Layla nodded, her mind already shifting to the next task. The centre was her lifeline, her refuge. It had been there for her in her darkest times, when she had lost her husband and found herself raising twins alone. Over the years, it had become more than just a place to work. It was a symbol of resilience and hope, and she couldn't let anything jeopardize that. "Mommy!" Julia's voice rang out, pulling Layla from her thoughts. She turned to see her daughter bounding toward her, clutching a crumpled piece of paper. "Look at my drawing! It's for the gala!" Layla crouched to Julia's level, smiling as her daughter proudly held up a colorful illustration of the community center surrounded by smiling children. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," she said, her heart swelling. "We'll make sure it has a special place at the event." "Where's Jacob?" Layla asked, glancing around for her son. "He's with Mr. Carter," Julia replied, referring to one of the center's volunteers. "They're fixing the soccer nets." Layla nodded, standing as Julia skipped off to join her friends. Despite the chaos of her schedule, moments like these reminded her why she worked so hard. The center wasn't just a job, it was a legacy she was building for her children. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking her reverie. She glanced at the screen, her brow furrowing at the unfamiliar number. Normally she would let such calls go to voicemail, but something compelled her to answer. "Hello? Ms. Whitmore, this is Bradley Green," came the voice on the other end, calm and measured. "I'm conducting a private inquiry and was hoping to ask you a few questions." Layla's grip on the phone tightened. "What kind of inquiry?" she asked, her tone wary. "I'm looking into some family history," Bradley replied smoothly. "It's a private matter, and I assure you my intentions are respectful. Could we arrange a time to speak?" Layla hesitated, her instincts immediately on edge. She wasn't used to strangers asking personal questions, and the timing felt odd. "I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that," she said carefully. "Perhaps you could explain more." "I understand your hesitation," Bradley said, his tone professional. "I'm simply trying to piece together some information that may involve your family. If you're willing, I'd appreciate your cooperation." Layla's stomach tightened. Something about this felt wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint why. "I'll have to think about it," she said finally, her voice firm. "Of course," Bradley replied. "I'll follow up soon. Thank you for your time." As the call ended, Layla stared at her phone, a growing unease settling over her. She didn't like the intrusion, and the mention of her family only deepened her suspicion. Shaking her head, she pushed the thought aside. There was too much to do, and she couldn't afford distractions. Layla slipped her phone back into her pocket, but the conversation with Bradley lingered in her mind like an unwelcome guest. She tried to shake it off, focusing on the tasks at hand, but a nagging sense of unease persisted. Why would a private investigator be interested in her family? And what exactly was he looking for? The sound of children's laughter outside drew her attention, offering a welcome reprieve from her thoughts. She stepped out of the community center and into the courtyard, where Jacob was helping Mr. Carter untangle the worn soccer nets. Jacob's face lit up when he saw her, his enthusiasm contagious. "Mum, look, we're fixing it so we can play again," he called, waving a hand. Layla smiled, her heart softening as she watched her son. "Great job, buddy. Keep up the good work," she said, her voice warm but distracted. Her eyes scanned the courtyard, her mind still racing through possibilities about the phone call. "Everything okay?" Mr. Carter asked, straightening up and brushing dust from his hands. He was an older man, kind and dependable, and had been a steady presence at the center for years. "Just a busy day," Layla replied, forcing a smile. "But we're making progress." Mr. Carter gave her a knowing look. "You're doing a lot, Layla. Make sure you take a moment to breathe. The center isn't going anywhere." She nodded, appreciating the sentiment, even if it felt impossible to follow. "Thanks, Mr. Carter. I'll try." As she turned back toward the building, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Melissa. "New donor interest. Wants to meet tomorrow. Check email." Layla's brows lifted in surprise. The gala's success depended on generous donors, and every potential lead was critical. She hurried inside, heading straight to her office and opening her laptop. The email from Melissa was brief but intriguing. A prospective donor named Simon Caldwell had expressed interest in supporting the gala. Simon Caldwell, she murmured, tasting the name. It sounded vaguely familiar, though she couldn't place it. The email included a request for a meeting at the center tomorrow afternoon. The name gnawed at her as she sat back in her chair, staring at the screen. There was no obvious reason why it unsettled her, yet the feeling was undeniable. After a moment, she shook her head, chiding herself for overthinking. A donor was a donor, and if Simon Caldwell could help keep the center afloat, she wasn't in a position to refuse. Still, a flicker of doubt remained, intertwining with the strange phone call she'd received earlier. Layla couldn't help but feel like the pieces of a puzzle were forming around her, though she had no idea what the picture would reveal. Outside her office, the sounds of the community center carried on. Children laughing, volunteers chatting, the faint scrape of chairs being moved in preparation for the day's activities. Layla closed her laptop and stood, determined to stay focused on the work in front of her. Whatever was coming, she would deal with it when the time came. But as she walked back into the main hall, a thought struck her. Simon Caldwell. Why did that name make her feel as though something familiar and distant was edging closer, threatening to unravel the carefully built world she had worked so hard to protect? The following afternoon, Layla stood near the entrance of the community center, smoothing the fabric of her navy blouse and glancing at the clock on the wall. The appointment with Simon Caldwell was only minutes away, and though she told herself it was just another meeting with a potential donor, a sense of unease lingered. His name was still unfamiliar, yet it carried an inexplicable weight. Shaking off the thought, she refocused on the task at hand, securing funding for the center's future. "Layla, he's here," Melissa called softly from the front desk, gesturing toward a tall man stepping through the door. Simon Caldwell exuded confidence as he approached, his stride deliberate and assured. Dressed in a tailored suit, he seemed every bit the successful businessman. But as their eyes met, Layla felt an odd sense of recognition, though she couldn't place it. He extended a hand, his grip firm yet unassuming. "Ms. Whitmore," Simon said, his tone warm but measured. "Thank you for meeting with me." "Mr. Caldwell," Layla replied, managing a polite smile. "Thank you for your interest in supporting the community center. Please, follow me." She led him to a quiet meeting room, its walls adorned with photos of smiling children and families who had benefited from the center's programs. Layla gestured toward a chair, and they both sat down. "I've heard great things about the work you do here," Simon began, his gaze briefly flickering to the photographs. "It's impressive and important," Layla inclined her head. "We're proud of what we've built, but maintaining it is always a challenge. That's why we rely so heavily on the generosity of donors like yourself." Simon nodded, though his focus seemed elsewhere. He leaned forward slightly, clasping his hands together. "Ms. Whitmore, I'll be honest. I'm here for more than just the gala. I wanted to meet you personally." The shift in tone caught Layla off guard, and her smile faltered. "Oh," she said cautiously. "May I ask why?" Simon hesitated for a fraction of a second, his usually steady demeanor faltering. "There's something personal I need to discuss with you, something I believe may involve your family." Layla's stomach dropped, her earlier unease returning with force. "I'm sorry, what?" she said, her voice tightening. "What does my family have to do with this?" Simon took a slow breath, choosing his words carefully. "Yesterday, I happened to see you and your children at the park, and—" He paused, searching for the right approach. "There's something about them, about their resemblance to me, that I can't ignore." I believe there's a chance I might be connected to them." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily between them. Layla's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to anger. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice low but firm. "But my children are not a topic for your curiosity." "It's not a game," Simon replied quickly, his tone steady but urgent. "I'm not here to disrupt your life, Ms. Whitmore. I just need to know the truth." Layla's eyes narrowed, her composure slipping as the full weight of Simon's words sank in. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You have no right," she said, her voice trembling with restrained anger. "Whatever it is you think you know or suspect, it doesn't give you the right to walk into my life and make these kinds of accusations." Simon rose as well, holding his hands up in a gesture of calm. "I'm not trying to accuse you of anything," he said evenly. "I know how this must sound, and I understand your frustration. But I wouldn't have come here if I didn't think there was something important at stake." Layla crossed her arms, the protective instinct of a mother rising to the surface. "Important at stake?" she echoed bitterly. "The only thing at stake here is my family's privacy. My children are my world, Mr. Caldwell, and I won't let anyone come in and disrupt their lives, especially not someone I just met." Simon hesitated, sensing the fragility of the moment. He knew he was walking a fine line, but he couldn't back away now. "Please," he said, his tone softening. "Just hear me out. I don't want to cause you or your children any harm. I need clarity." Layla exhaled sharply, her eyes locking onto his. There was sincerity in his voice, but it only deepened her confusion. "Clarity about what? You think you're their father? Is that it?" Simon stiffened at the directness of her words, but he nodded. "I don't know for certain," he admitted. "But based on the timeline and the resemblance, yes, I think it's possible." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Layla's mind raced, caught between disbelief and a growing sense of dread. The idea was preposterous, yet Simon's confidence made it hard to dismiss outright. She took a step back, trying to put distance between herself and the man who was suddenly threatening the careful balance of her life. "Do you know how ridiculous this sounds?" she asked, her voice quieter now but no less sharp. "Even if you were connected to my children somehow, what do you expect me to do with that information?" Simon's shoulders relaxed slightly, relieved that she hadn't stormed out of the room. "I don't expect anything from you, Ms. Whitmore," he said. "I just want the truth. If I'm wrong, I'll leave you and your family alone. But if I'm right, don't you think they have a right to know?" Layla flinched at his words, the implication cutting deep. She thought of Jacob and Julia, their bright smiles and unshakable trust in her. The idea of introducing chaos into their lives, of opening a door to questions she wasn't prepared to answer, filled her with dread. She shook her head, her voice trembling. "This isn't your decision to make. My children are happy. They're loved. That's all they need." Simon didn't argue. He could see the fierce protectiveness in her eyes, the walls she had built to keep her family safe. "I understand," he said quietly, "and I don't want to take anything away from them, or from you. But I also can't ignore this. Not until I know for sure." Layla stared at him, her emotions a tangled knot of anger, fear, and uncertainty. Finally she spoke, her tone firm but reluctant. "You want clarity? Fine. But you'd better be ready to accept whatever the truth is, Mr. Caldwell, because once this door is open, there's no closing it." Simon nodded, the weight of her words settling heavily on him. "I understand," he said. Without another word, Layla turned and walked out of the room, leaving Simon standing alone. The photographs on the wall seemed to watch him, silent witnesses to the tension that had just unfolded. He let out a slow breath, knowing this was only the beginning. As he stepped out of the community centre moments later, the sun glaring overhead, Simon felt the enormity of what lay ahead. He had gotten her to agree to take the first step, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the path they were about to tread would be anything but simple. Layla sat at her kitchen table that evening, staring blankly at the cup of tea in her hands. The familiar sounds of Jacob and Julia's laughter drifted in from the living room, normally a source of comfort, but now a reminder of the fragile balance she had spent years maintaining. Her conversation with Simon Caldwell replayed in her mind, his words digging deeper into her thoughts with every repetition. She had been so certain, so unwavering in the decisions she'd made for her family. She had built their life from the ground up after losing her husband, creating a world where her children felt secure and loved. The idea that a stranger could come in and disrupt that was infuriating. And yet, Simon's sincerity lingered, impossible to ignore. "Mom!" Julia's voice broke through her reverie. Layla looked up to see her daughter standing in the doorway, her favorite stuffed animal tucked under one arm. "Why are you sad?" Layla forced a smile, setting down her cup. "I'm not sad, sweetheart," she said gently. "Just thinking." Julia's brow furrowed, her perceptiveness cutting through Layla's attempt at reassurance. "About the man from the centre." Layla froze for a moment, startled by Julia's intuition. "How did you know about that?" she asked carefully. "I saw him," Julia said simply. "He looked nice. Is he going to help the centre?" Layla hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Maybe," she said finally. "We'll see." Satisfied, Julia nodded and scampered back to the living room, leaving Layla alone with her thoughts once more. Her daughter's innocent question only deepened the conflict within her. If Simon's claims were true, what did that mean for Jacob and Julia? Did they deserve to know the truth, even if it meant upending their world? Her phone buzzed on the table, pulling her back to the present. It was a message from Melissa. "Hope the meeting went well. Fingers crossed for the gala." Layla sighed, her mind still too tangled to focus on the fundraiser. She typed a quick reply, thanking Melissa for her support, then set the phone aside. She needed clarity, but every instinct told her the answers Simon sought would lead to more questions she wasn't sure she could face. Hours later, after putting the twins to bed, Layla stood at the window, staring out at the quiet street. The night was calm, but her thoughts were anything but. Against her better judgment, she found herself picking up the phone and dialing a familiar number. "Sarah," she said when her elderly neighbor answered. "Do you have a minute? I could use some advice." A few minutes later, Layla sat across from Sarah in the older woman's cozy living room. The faint scent of lavender filled the air, and the soft glow of a table lamp cast warm shadows on the walls. Sarah, with her silver hair neatly pinned back, poured 2 cups of chamomile tea and handed one to Layla. Her calm presence was exactly what Layla needed. "So," Sarah said, settling into her chair, her keen eyes studying Layla, "what's got you so tied up in knots?" Layla hesitated, tracing her finger along the rim of her cup. She had always valued Sarah's wisdom, but this felt almost too personal to share. Yet the weight of it all pushed her to speak. "Something happened today," she began slowly. "A man, Simon Caldwell, came to the centre. He claims he might be connected to my children." Sarah raised an eyebrow, her expression remaining neutral. "Connected how?" Layla exhaled, her grip tightening on the cup. "He thinks he might be their biological father. He saw us at the park and I don't know. He says there's a resemblance, and something about the timeline. It matches up with when he donated to a fertility clinic years ago." Sarah leaned back, taking in Layla's words. She didn't speak immediately, giving Layla the space to continue. "I don't even know where to begin," Layla admitted. "I've spent years building a life for my kids. They're happy, Sarah. They're secure. And now this man just shows up, thinking he has a right to—" Her voice broke off, frustration and uncertainty mingling. "Did he say what he wants?" Sarah asked gently. Layla nodded. "He says he just wants the truth. He says he'll leave us alone if he's wrong. But if he's right, he thinks Jacob and Julia deserve to know." For a long moment, Sarah was quiet, her gaze thoughtful. Finally, she set her cup down and leaned forward. "Let me ask you something, Layla. Are you afraid of what this might mean for your kids? Or are you afraid of what it might mean for you?" The question hit Layla like a wave, its truth undeniable. "Both," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been everything to them for so long. I don't know how to let someone else be part of that." Sarah reached out, placing a comforting hand on Layla's. "I know you've worked hard to protect them, and you've done a beautiful job. But protecting them doesn't mean keeping the truth from them. Sometimes it means facing it head-on, even when it's painful." Layla's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away. "What if it's too much? What if it hurts them?" Sarah's grip tightened, her voice steady. "Then you'll do what you've always done. You'll be there for them, just like you've always been. But don't let fear make the decision for you." Layla nodded slowly, the tension in her chest loosening just slightly. Sarah's words didn't erase her fears, but they gave her something to hold on to. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Anytime," Sarah replied with a warm smile. "You've got this, Layla. Whatever happens, you'll figure it out." As Layla left Sarah's house and stepped into the cool night air, she felt a flicker of clarity amid the uncertainty. She wasn't ready to make any decisions yet, but she knew one thing for sure. She would do whatever it took to protect her children, even if that meant confronting the truth. Inside her own home, she checked on Jacob and Julia, watching them sleep peacefully, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of a nightlight. Her resolve hardened. Whatever the next steps were, she would face them head-on, for their sake. The following afternoon, Layla found herself pacing near the community center's entrance once again. This time, the tension in her chest was heavier. After a sleepless night and Sarah's reassuring words, she had reluctantly agreed to meet Simon again. She still wasn't sure if it was the right decision, but ignoring the situation wasn't an option anymore. If Simon was serious about uncovering the truth, then she needed to know exactly what she was dealing with, for her children's sake. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled her from her thoughts. Simon appeared, dressed more casually this time, his suit jacket replaced by a simple button-down shirt. There was a cautiousness in his expression, as though he was unsure of how she would receive him. Layla folded her arms, grounding herself before speaking. "Thank you for meeting me," Simon said, stopping a respectful distance away. "I'm not sure why I agreed," Layla replied, her tone guarded. "But if we're going to have this conversation, I need you to be honest. No half-truths, no games." Simon nodded, his face solemn. "I wouldn't expect anything less." She led him to the small courtyard behind the community center where the children often played. It was quieter than the meeting rooms inside, and the open air seemed to ease some of the tension. They sat on opposite ends of a picnic table, the distance between them a silent reminder of the emotional chasm they were navigating. "So," Layla began, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions beneath the surface, "what exactly do you want from me?" Simon hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting to the playground equipment in the distance. "I want to understand," he said finally. "When I saw Jacob and Julia at the park, it was like looking in a mirror. And when I spoke to you, the timeline, it just made sense. I couldn't ignore it. Layla tightened her grip on the edge of the table. And what if you're wrong? What if this is all just a coincidence? Simon leaned forward slightly, his eyes meeting hers. Then I'll leave you and your family alone. I promise. But if I'm right— He paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then I'd like the chance to be part of their lives. Only if you're willing. His words hit Layla harder than she expected, stirring feelings she had buried long ago. The idea of sharing her children, of letting someone else into the world she had fought so hard to build, it terrified her. But at the same time, Simon's sincerity was impossible to dismiss. You don't understand what you're asking, she said quietly. It's not just about you or me. It's about them, their happiness, their stability. If this goes wrong, if you walk away after this, it could hurt them more than you realize. Simon's jaw tightened, his expression resolute. I'm not walking away, he said firmly. Not unless you tell me to. Layla's chest tightened as she looked at him, torn between her instinct to protect her children and the possibility that Simon might genuinely care. I'll think about it, she said finally, rising from her seat. But for now, I need time, and I need you to be patient. Simon nodded, his expression softening. Take all the time you need. Layla walked away, her thoughts swirling with doubt and uncertainty, leaving Simon at the table. She needed space, but deep down she knew this conversation had only scratched the surface. As she entered the community center, she stopped by the hallway bulletin board, running her fingers absent-mindedly over a photo of Jacob and Julia taken during a summer event. Their bright, carefree smiles were a testament to the life she had worked so hard to give them, a life that now felt fragile under Simon's scrutiny. Inside her office, Layla closed the door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. She had told Simon she needed time, but what she truly needed were answers. She couldn't make any decisions until she knew the full truth, no matter how much it terrified her. Her phone buzzed on the desk, drawing her attention. It was a text from Sarah. Thinking of you. Remember, the truth doesn't have to break you. It can set you free. Layla's lips curved into a faint smile. Leave it to Sarah to know exactly when to offer a lifeline. Meanwhile, outside in the courtyard, Simon remained seated, his gaze fixed on the playground equipment in the distance. He was acutely aware of the stakes, not just for himself, but for Layla and her children. Her guardedness was understandable, even expected, but it didn't make it any easier to face. He pulled out his phone and tapped a message to Bradley. Any updates? I need something concrete soon. Moments later, Bradley's reply came through. Still working on it. Got a lead from the clinic records. I'll keep you posted. Simon sighed, running a hand through his hair. The waiting was excruciating, but he knew he couldn't rush this process. He had to tread carefully, not just for Layla's sake, but for the sake of the children he was beginning to feel an unexpected connection to, even if it was only imagined for now. As the afternoon stretched on, Layla returned to the courtyard, her steps slower, her expression softer. She wasn't sure why she came back. Perhaps it was to see if Simon had left, or perhaps it was something else. Something unspoken. To her surprise, he was still there, sitting quietly with his hands folded, his gaze distant. I thought you'd be gone by now, she said, her voice carrying a hint of surprise. Simon looked up, offering a faint smile. I told you I'm not walking away. Layla hesitated, her arms crossing instinctively. She wasn't used to this, someone willing to stick around, to fight for a place in a world she had fiercely protected for years. If you're serious about this, she began slowly, then you need to understand something. Jacob and Julia are my everything. Their happiness comes first. Always. Simon stood, his expression earnest. I wouldn't want it any other way, he said. I know this isn't easy for you, Layla. It's not easy for me either. But I promise you, I'm here for the right reasons. Her defenses wavered slightly, though she quickly steeled herself again. Then prove it, she said simply. Until you do, this conversation is over. Simon nodded, understanding the challenge in her words. I will, he said firmly. As Layla turned to leave, she felt a small, flickering hope in the midst of her doubts. She wasn't ready to trust him, not yet, but for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this story could have a resolution that wouldn't tear her world apart. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the soccer field as Jacob darted across the grass, his laughter echoing through the crisp air. Simon stood at the edge of the field, his hands in his pockets, watching with a mix of trepidation and quiet admiration. This was the first time Layla had allowed him to spend time with the children, albeit in a carefully controlled setting. She sat on a nearby bench, her watchful eyes a constant reminder that trust was still a long way off. Good kick, Simon called, as Jacob sent the ball soaring toward the makeshift goal. The boy looked up, grinning, then quickly returned to the game with his friends. Julia sat a few feet away from Simon, her small hands busy coloring a picture on a clipboard. She hadn't said much since he arrived, but every so often she glanced up at him with curious eyes. What are you drawing? Simon asked gently, crouching to her level. A unicorn, Julia replied without looking up, her tone matter-of-fact. It's for the community center gala. Simon nodded, watching her small hand move across the paper with precise strokes. It's beautiful. Are you going to show it to everyone? Julia paused, her lips pursing thoughtfully. Maybe, she said. Mom says it's important. She says people will like it. I'm sure they will, Simon said, his voice warm, especially if you made it. Julia glanced at him again, a flicker of a smile breaking through her usually reserved demeanor. Do you like unicorns? Simon chuckled softly. I think they're pretty magical. That answer seemed to satisfy her. She returned to her drawing, her shoulders relaxing slightly. Simon took it as a small victory, a step toward earning her trust, even if it was just through a shared appreciation of imaginary creatures. On the field, Jacob called out, Mr. Simon, come play with us! The boy's excitement was infectious, and Simon felt a pang of unexpected emotion. He hesitated, glancing toward Layla for approval. She gave him a small nod, her expression unreadable. Simon stepped onto the field, his polished demeanor giving way to a rare playfulness as he joined the game. The children cheered as he passed the ball to Jacob, who sprinted toward the goal. For a few moments the world felt lighter, free from the tension that had lingered since his first encounter with Layla and the twins. Layla watched from the bench, her arms crossed tightly. She wanted to ignore the scene in front of her, to remind herself that Simon's presence was temporary, conditional. But as she saw Jacob laughing and Julia sneaking glances at Simon's interactions, a part of her wondered if she was holding on too tightly, if she was too afraid to let anyone else share the bond she had with her children. As the game continued, Simon couldn't help but feel an unexpected joy in the simple act of playing soccer with the children. Jacob's enthusiasm was contagious, and soon Simon found himself fully immersed in the game, laughing as the boy managed to outmaneuver him and score another goal. The other children cheered, declaring Jacob the star of the match. You've got some serious skills, Simon said, clapping Jacob on the shoulder as they walked off the field. Where'd you learn to play like that? Jacob beamed, puffing out his chest with pride. Mom taught me. She's really good, even better than Mr. Carter. Simon glanced at Layla, who was still seated on the bench, her arms no longer crossed. She gave a small, reluctant smile when she noticed him looking, though her guard remained firmly in place. "Your mum must be pretty awesome then," Simon said, ruffling Jacob's hair. The boy nodded enthusiastically before running off to join his friends, leaving Simon standing alone with a strange mix of emotions. He hadn't expected to feel this connected. Yet with every interaction, every laugh, it was becoming harder to deny the possibility that these children might be his. Julia, now finished with her drawing, approached cautiously, clutching the colourful sheet of paper. "Can I show you something?" she asked quietly. "Of course," Simon replied, crouching to meet her eye level. Julia held up the drawing, a vibrant scene of the community centre surrounded by children, with a large unicorn standing in the middle. "This is for the gala," she said proudly. "Do you think it'll help?" Simon studied the picture, a genuine smile breaking across his face. "It's perfect," he said sincerely. "I think it'll make the gala even more special." Julia smiled shyly, her confidence bolstered by his words. "Maybe you can help me pick the best place to put it." Simon nodded, standing as Julia ran ahead toward Layla, waving the drawing in her hands. "Mommy, look! He said it's perfect." Layla smiled faintly at her daughter, smoothing a hand over Julia's hair before looking at Simon. "Thank you for humouring her," she said quietly as he approached. "She can be a little shy." "She's creative," Simon replied. "And Jacob's got a real knack for soccer. You've raised two incredible kids, Layla." Layla's expression softened for a moment, but she quickly composed herself. "Thank you," she said, her voice measured. "But I hope you understand. This doesn't change anything. I'm still trying to figure out where we go from here." Simon nodded, his tone serious. "I understand. And I'll respect whatever decision you make. But I want to earn your trust, and theirs, even if it takes time." Layla didn't respond immediately, her gaze drifting back to her children, who were now playing together near the field. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider what Simon's presence might mean, not just for her, but for Jacob and Julia. It was a fragile possibility, but one she couldn't ignore any longer. As the afternoon drew to a close, Simon said his goodbyes, leaving Layla with a lingering sense of unease and a glimmer of hope. He had taken a small step forward, but the path ahead was still uncertain for all of them. The community centre bustled with activity as Layla moved between the event planning committee, volunteers and parents, dropping off donations for the upcoming gala. The air buzzed with anticipation, but Layla's mind was elsewhere. Despite her best efforts, Simon Caldwell's presence continued to linger like a shadow. His interactions with Jacob and Julia had been surprisingly positive, but they also raised questions Layla wasn't ready to answer, not to herself and certainly not to her children. As she sorted through a stack of donation forms, Melissa appeared at her side, her expression both curious and concerned. "You've been quiet today," Melissa said, handing Layla another pile of forms. "Not like you to keep your head down for this long." Layla managed a faint smile. "Just a lot on my mind." Melissa tilted her head, her sharp intuition evident. "Wouldn't have anything to do with our mysterious new donor, would it? Simon Caldwell?" Layla sighed, setting the papers aside. "It's complicated." "Complicated how?" Melissa pressed gently, pulling up a chair. "I've seen the way he looks at the kids. It's like he's trying to memorize every detail." Layla hesitated, torn between the instinct to confide in her friend and the desire to keep everything contained. Finally, she relented. "He thinks he might be their father," she said quietly, her words laced with exhaustion. Melissa's eyes widened. "What? How is that even possible?" Layla gave a brief summary of Simon's claims, keeping her voice low. "He's not demanding anything, at least not yet, but he's also not going away. And the truth is, I don't know if he's right. But the idea that he might be—" She trailed off, her hands clenching into fists. "Have you thought about how you're going to handle this?" Melissa asked carefully. "I mean, if he's telling the truth, where does that leave you? And them?" "That's the problem," Layla admitted. "I don't know. All I've ever done is protect them, make sure they felt safe. Letting someone else in, someone who could hurt them, I don't know if I can do that." Melissa reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Layla's. "I know it's scary, but you don't have to make every decision alone. And maybe letting him in isn't such a bad thing. If he really is their father, don't they deserve to know him?" Layla's chest tightened at the thought, but she nodded slowly. "Maybe," she said softly, "but I need to be sure first." Before Melissa could respond, the door to the community center swung open, and Lucas Dawson strode in, his presence commanding immediate attention. His sharp suit and practiced smile gave him the air of someone who knew exactly how to take charge of a room. Layla's stomach sank at the sight of him. "Layla," Lucas greeted, his voice smooth and insincere. "I hear the gala is shaping up nicely. I wanted to stop by and see if there's anything I can do to help." Layla straightened, her professional demeanor snapping into place. "Mr. Dawson," she said coolly, "we appreciate your interest, but everything is under control." "Of course," Lucas said, his smile never wavering. "But I couldn't resist stopping by. After all, I hear there's been some interesting developments around here lately." Layla's eyes narrowed as she took in Lucas's cryptic comment. She had dealt with him enough to know that every word he said was calculated, designed to get under her skin. "I'm not sure what you're referring to," she replied, keeping her tone even. Lucas chuckled softly, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing back on her. "Oh, nothing specific," he said lightly. "Just some chatter about a new donor, Mr. Caldwell, wasn't it? Seems like quite the coincidence, him taking such an interest in your little center all of a sudden." Layla's stomach tightened, though she kept her expression neutral. "Our donor's motivations are none of your concern," she said firmly. "If you don't have anything constructive to contribute, I suggest you let us get back to work." "Always so guarded," Lucas mused, his tone dripping with mock sincerity. "But I understand. You have to protect what's important to you." His gaze lingered for a beat too long, and Layla felt the unspoken implication hanging in the air. "Good day, Mr. Dawson," she said pointedly, turning away before he could respond. Melissa approached as soon as Lucas left, her brow furrowed. "What was that about?" she asked. Layla shook her head, exhaling sharply. "Lucas never shows up without a reason. Whatever he's up to, it can't be good." "You think he's fishing for something?" Melissa asked, lowering her voice. "Maybe," Layla said, glancing toward the door as if expecting Lucas to reappear. "Or maybe he already knows too much." Before Melissa could reply, Layla's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from Simon. "I need to speak with you. Can we meet?" Her first instinct was to ignore it, to bury herself in the work that still needed to be done for the gala. But Lucas's visit had unsettled her, and the growing tension surrounding Simon was impossible to ignore. She needed clarity, and if Simon had any updates, now was the time to hear them. "I'll be back," Layla said to Melissa, grabbing her coat. "Cover for me if anyone asks." Melissa nodded, though her concern was evident. "Be careful," she said, "and don't let Lucas get to you." Layla left the community center and headed toward the small cafe Simon had suggested in his message. When she arrived, she spotted him sitting at a corner table, a stack of papers in front of him. His expression was serious, but his eyes softened when he saw her approach. "Thank you for coming," Simon said as she slid into the seat across from him. "I almost didn't," Layla admitted, folding her arms on the table. "So this better be important." "It is," Simon said, his tone grave. He pushed the papers toward her, his hand lingering for a moment before pulling back. These are the clinic's records. Bradley was able to confirm everything. Layla hesitated before picking up the papers, her pulse quickening as she skimmed the contents. The words blurred together for a moment, but one thing stood out with unmistakable clarity. Simon's name, listed as the donor. Her breath caught, and she looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "So it's true." Simon nodded, his expression a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "I didn't want to believe it at first," he said quietly, "but I had to know. And now we do." Layla's mind raced, the enormity of the revelation crashing down on her. She had spent years building a life for her children, never imagining that this moment could come. Now, everything was changing, and she wasn't sure how to hold it all together. "What do you expect me to do with this, Simon?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What am I supposed to tell them?" Simon leaned forward, his gaze steady. "We don't have to decide that right now," he said gently. "All I'm asking is for a chance to be in their lives, not as a disruption, but as someone who cares about them, someone who wants to be there." Layla looked down at the papers again, her emotions a tangled knot of fear, anger, and something she couldn't quite name. She didn't respond, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Simon waited patiently, understanding that this was only the beginning of a much larger conversation. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he felt like he was on the right path. The community center hummed with energy as preparations for the gala entered their final stages. Volunteers bustled about, stringing lights, arranging tables, and setting up displays that showcased the center's impact on the community. Layla moved among them, directing the efforts with a practiced efficiency, though her mind was anything but settled. The confirmation of Simon's connection to Jacob and Julia weighed heavily on her, a truth she couldn't yet figure out how to address. "Layla, the seating chart is ready," Melissa said, appearing at her side with a clipboard. "I triple-checked everything, but you might want to take a look." Layla nodded absently, taking the clipboard but barely glancing at it. "Thanks, Melissa. I'll look it over in a bit." Melissa hesitated, studying her friend with concern. "Are you okay? You've been distant the past couple of days?" "I'm fine," Layla said quickly, though the unconvincing tone in her voice betrayed her. She sighed, setting the clipboard down. "It's just, everything feels like it's happening all at once." Melissa gave her a knowing look. "By everything, you mean Simon Caldwell?" Layla didn't respond immediately, but the slight slump of her shoulders was answer enough. "He's not going away," she admitted. "And the truth is, I don't know if I want him to." Melissa's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly recovered. "That's a big shift from where you started." "I know," Layla said, rubbing her temples. "But now that I know he's their father, it feels wrong to shut him out. At the same time, I don't know how to let him in without turning our lives upside down." Melissa reached out, squeezing Layla's arm. "You don't have to figure it all out today. Focus on the gala, one step at a time, right?" Layla nodded, though the knot in her chest remained tight. "One step at a time," she echoed. The sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention. Layla turned to see Simon walking into the room, his gaze scanning the bustling scene before landing on her. He carried a box, his expression a mix of determination and something softer, something that made Layla's pulse quicken despite herself. "Good timing," Melissa said, stepping aside with a grin. "Looks like your new donor is here to help." Layla shot her a warning look before turning to Simon. "What's in the box?" she asked, keeping her tone professional. "Some decorations for the gala," Simon replied, setting the box down on a nearby table. "Bradley mentioned you might need a few extras, so I figured I'd pitch in." Layla glanced at the contents. Strings of fairy lights, elegant table runners, and a few centerpieces that looked far too expensive for the community center's budget. "This is a lot," she said, her voice softening despite herself. "Thank you." Simon shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "It's the least I could do. Besides, I figured I'd stick around and help set up, if that's okay with you." Layla hesitated, but after a moment she nodded. "Sure, just try not to overstep." "I'll follow your lead," Simon said, his tone earnest. Simon rolled up his sleeves and joined the team of volunteers, his movements uncharacteristically unpolished as he helped untangle strings of fairy lights and position them around the room. Though his usual environment involved high-powered meetings and corporate negotiations, he found surprising satisfaction in this simpler, hands-on work. It was a rare glimpse into a world so different from his own, and for once he didn't feel like an outsider. Layla observed him from across the room, her emotions a tangle of gratitude and wariness. He was trying, there was no denying that, but the stakes were higher than he seemed to understand. She had built this center, and her life with Jacob and Julia, on a foundation of stability and independence. Letting Simon in risked upsetting that balance, no matter how genuine his intentions seemed. "Mom?" Julia's voice interrupted Layla's thoughts. She turned to see her daughter bounding into the room, holding up a piece of paper. "Look, Mr. Carter said we can hang my drawing right by the front door so everyone will see it when they come in." Layla crouched to Julia's level, smiling as she examined the colorful illustration. "That's perfect, sweetheart. It'll be the first thing people notice, and they're going to love it." "Can Mr. Simon see it too?" Julia asked, glancing toward him. Layla hesitated, her instinct to shield her children clashing with the reality of Simon's growing involvement. "Of course," she said finally, rising to her feet and taking Julia's hand. Together, they crossed the room to where Simon was helping string lights along the wall. "Julia has something to show you," Layla said, her voice carefully neutral. Simon straightened, wiping his hands on his pants before crouching to Julia's level. "What do you have there?" he asked, his tone warm. Julia held up the drawing, her face glowing with pride. "It's for the gala. Mom said everyone will see it when they walk in." Simon studied the picture, his expression softening as he took in the vibrant details. "This is amazing," he said sincerely. "You're really talented, Julia. I think it's going to be the highlight of the whole event." Julia beamed, clearly delighted by his praise. "Do you really think so?" "I know so," Simon replied with a smile. "And if you need help hanging it up, I'm your guy." "Okay," Julia said, already tugging on his hand to lead him toward the door. Layla followed at a distance, her heart aching with a mixture of hope and fear. Watching Simon interact with Julia, she couldn't deny the natural ease between them. It was a glimpse of what could be, a family dynamic that was both unfamiliar and strangely comforting. As the day wore on, Simon continued to pitch in, helping set up tables, stringing lights, and even assisting Mr. Carter with some last-minute repairs. His presence didn't go unnoticed, drawing murmurs from the volunteers and staff. While most seemed to appreciate his contributions, Layla couldn't ignore the questions in their eyes. She knew it was only a matter of time before people started asking why he was here and what his connection to her and the children was. By the time evening rolled around, the community center was transformed. The once plain hall now shimmered with lights, elegant decorations, and the promise of an unforgettable evening. Layla stood in the center of the room, surveying the results with a sense of pride and relief. Despite everything, they had managed to pull it together. Simon approached her, his expression weary but satisfied. "It's looking good," he said, gesturing to the room. "You and your team did an incredible job." Layla glanced at him, her defenses softening just slightly. "You helped," she admitted. "Thank you for that." Simon smiled faintly, though his eyes held a deeper emotion. I just want to be part of something that matters, he said quietly. And this, what you've built here, it matters. Layla didn't respond immediately, unsure of how to process the sincerity in his words. Finally, she said, "The gala is important to a lot of people. I'm glad you see that." Before Simon could reply, Melissa appeared at Layla's side, her expression tense. "Layla, can I talk to you for a second?" Layla frowned but nodded, stepping aside with her friend. "What's wrong?" "It's Lucas," Melissa said in a low voice. "He's been asking questions about Simon, about the center, about you. I don't like it." Layla's stomach twisted. "What kind of questions?" "Everything," Melissa replied. "Who Simon is, why he's here, how you're connected. He's digging, Layla, and I don't think it's just idle curiosity." Layla glanced towards Simon, who was now helping Julia hang her drawing by the front door. The sight should have been reassuring, but Lucas's interference cast a dark cloud over the moment. "I'll handle it," she said firmly, though her voice carried the weight of uncertainty. Melissa nodded, her concern evident. "Just be careful. Lucas doesn't play fair, and I've got a bad feeling about this." As the volunteers began wrapping up for the night, Layla lingered near the door, her mind racing. The gala was supposed to be a celebration, a chance to highlight the community center's achievements and secure its future. But with Lucas poking around and Simon's growing involvement, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get even more complicated. The night of the gala arrived, and the community center gleamed with a sense of pride and purpose. Guests filled the hall, their chatter blending with soft music as they admired the decorations and displays. Layla stood near the entrance, welcoming attendees with a smile that masked the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. The gala was her chance to secure the center's future, and every detail had to go perfectly. Julia's drawing hung prominently near the front door, catching the eye of nearly everyone who entered. Layla caught snippets of praise from guests, many marveling at the talent behind the colorful depiction of the center's mission. Each kind word bolstered her spirits, but her focus remained on the bigger picture, raising enough funds to keep the center afloat for another year. "Layla," Melissa said, approaching her with a clipboard. "We're getting close to full attendance. Looks like everyone RSVP'd, and then some." "That's good news," Layla replied, scanning the room. "How are we doing with the silent auction?" Melissa's smile faltered slightly. "There's some interest, but not as much as we hoped for on the bigger ticket items. We might need to do more mingling to nudge people." Layla nodded, preparing to dive into the crowd, but a familiar voice stopped her in her tracks. "Ms. Whitmore?" Lucas Dawson said smoothly, stepping into her line of sight. He was impeccably dressed as always, his presence commanding attention despite the warm atmosphere around him. "Quite the turnout, I have to admit. I'm impressed." Layla's smile tightened as she met his gaze. "We're glad you could make it, Mr. Dawson. The community center appreciates your support." Lucas chuckled softly, his eyes sharp. "Support, yes. Though I can't help but notice a new face among your circle of benefactors. Simon Caldwell, isn't it?" Layla's stomach twisted, but she kept her expression neutral. "Simon has been very generous. His contributions have made a significant difference." "I'm sure they have," Lucas said, his tone light but laced with something darker. "But generosity always comes with a price, doesn't it? I just hope you know what you're getting into." Before Layla could respond, Lucas gave a small nod and drifted into the crowd, leaving her standing there with the weight of his words. Her eyes scanned the room until they landed on Simon, who was engaged in conversation with a group of donors near the auction tables. He seemed relaxed, confident even, as though he belonged in this world despite its unfamiliarity. Melissa touched her arm, breaking Layla's focus. "Are you okay?" Layla nodded quickly, though her thoughts were racing. "I'm fine," Let's focus on the auction." She moved through the room, engaging with guests, thanking donors, and doing her best to shake off the unease Lucas had planted. But no matter how hard she tried, the tension lingered, casting a shadow over what should have been a triumphant evening. As the evening progressed, Layla found herself weaving through the crowd, keeping up appearances while her mind remained preoccupied. The auction had picked up steam, with guests buzzing around the tables, placing bids and discussing the items on display. For a moment, Layla allowed herself to hope that they might hit their fundraising goal after all. Across the room, Simon caught her eye. He gave a small nod, a silent reassurance that he was there if she needed him. It was a simple gesture, but it steadied her nerves more than she wanted to admit. She returned the nod and moved toward the stage, where the MC was preparing to announce the next phase of the evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC said, his voice carrying over the hum of the crowd, "thank you all for being here tonight to support such an important cause. Your generosity means everything to the families and programs this center provides. Now, let's get ready for the live auction." The crowd applauded as Layla stepped up to the microphone, taking a deep breath before addressing the room. "Before we begin the live auction, I just want to say how grateful I am to see so many of you here tonight. This center has been a lifeline for our community, and it's because of people like you that we've been able to continue our mission. Thank you for believing in us." The applause was warm and genuine, bolstering Layla's confidence. As the auctioneer took over, Layla stepped off the stage, her smile faltering as she spotted Lucas lingering near the back of the room. He was speaking to a small group, his expression animated, but there was a sharpness in his demeanor that sent a chill through her. Whatever he was up to, it couldn't be good. Simon appeared at her side, his presence grounding her once again. "You're doing great," he said, his voice low but reassuring. "The room's energy is exactly what you need tonight." "Thanks," Layla replied, her eyes still on Lucas. "But I can't shake the feeling that he's up to something." Simon followed her gaze, his jaw tightening when he saw Lucas. "Do you want me to talk to him?" Layla shook her head quickly. "Number. The last thing I need is a scene. Just keep an eye on him, will you?" "Always," Simon said, his tone steady. The live auction began in earnest, with bids climbing higher than Layla had dared to hope. The enthusiasm in the room was palpable, and for a moment she allowed herself to believe that the evening would end on a high note. But as the final item, a weekend retreat donated by a local resort, was announced, the tension that had been simmering all night came to a head. Lucas stepped forward, his voice cutting through the crowd. "I'll bid 10,000, he announced, his tone casual but calculated. The room buzzed with whispers as the auctioneer acknowledged the bid. Layla's heart sank. She knew Lucas well enough to understand that his generosity came with strings attached, and she couldn't afford to let him gain any leverage over the center. Before she could react, Simon's voice rang out from the other side of the room. 15,000! The crowd erupted in murmurs as the two men locked eyes across the room. Lucas smirked, raising his hand again. 20. 25, Simon countered without hesitation, his voice calm but firm. The tension in the room was electric as the bids climbed higher, each one more pointed than the last. Layla's pulse raced, caught between gratitude for Simon's support and fear of what Lucas might do next. Finally, after a tense back and forth, Lucas raised his hands in mock surrender. "You win, Mr. Caldwell," he said with a sly grin. "For now." The auctioneer declared Simon the winner, and the crowd applauded, though the undercurrent of tension was impossible to ignore. Layla exhaled shakily, her mind spinning as she tried to process what had just happened. As the evening wound down and the guests began to trickle out, Simon approached her once again. "I'm sorry if I overstepped," he said, his expression sincere, "but I couldn't let him gain any kind of foothold here. You didn't overstep, Layla said, though her voice was weary. But Lucas isn't going to let this go. I just hope tonight didn't make things worse. Simon placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady. Whatever happens, we'll handle it together. You're not in this alone. Layla wanted to believe him, but as she glanced toward the door where Lucas had just exited, her doubts lingered. The gala had been a success, but the challenges ahead felt heavier than ever. The morning after the gala, Layla sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee untouched in front of her. The evening had been a success on the surface. Guests left impressed, the auction raised more than expected, and the centre's future seemed secure for the time being. But the confrontation between Simon and Lucas had cast a long shadow over everything. Layla's instincts told her that Lucas wasn't finished, and that made her uneasy. Jacob and Julia sat nearby, their laughter a bright counterpoint to Layla's somber thoughts as they planned their weekend. Julia was colouring again, this time working on a poster for her class project, while Jacob flipped through a book about soccer strategies, his excitement about an upcoming game bubbling over. "Mum, can we go to the park later?" Jacob asked, looking up from his book. "I want to try the new moves Mr. Carter taught me." Layla forced a smile, nodding. "Sure, sweetheart. We can go after lunch." The sound of her phone buzzing pulled her attention away. She glanced at the screen and felt a pang of dread when she saw Melissa's name. Answering quickly, she stood and moved to the other side of the room, lowering her voice. "Hey, Melissa. Everything okay?" "Not exactly," Melissa replied, her tone laced with concern. "I got an email this morning from Lucas's assistant. He's requesting financial records for the center, like everything from the past 5 years. Layla's heart sank. "What? Why? He has no authority to ask for that." "I know," Melissa said, "but you know how he is. If he wants to stir up trouble, he'll find a way. What do you want me to do?" Layla clenched her jaw, her grip tightening on the phone. "Don't send him anything. I'll handle this." "Okay," Melissa said hesitantly. "But be careful, Layla. He's got connections and he won't back down easily." After ending the call, Layla leaned against the counter, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. Lucas's interference wasn't just a personal attack, it threatened everything she had worked so hard to build, and she wasn't sure how to stop him. Before she could dwell on it further, there was a knock at the door. Wiping her hands on her jeans, she opened it to find Simon standing on the porch, his expression serious. "Simon," she said, surprised, "what are you doing here?" "I heard about Lucas," Simon said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Bradley called me this morning. He's been looking into Lucas and he found something you need to see." Layla shut the door, her nerves fraying. "What did he find?" Simon pulled out a folder, placing it on the table. "Evidence that Lucas has been manipulating property deals around Charleston. He's been driving up prices, cutting corners, and even falsifying reports to cover his tracks." Layla's eyes widened as she flipped through the documents. "This is damning. If this gets out, it could ruin him." Simon nodded. "Exactly, and I think that's why he's targeting you. He sees you, and the center, as an obstacle. If he can't control you, he'll do whatever he can to undermine you." Layla felt a surge of anger, her resolve hardening. "Then we use this. If he wants to come after me, fine, but I'm not letting him hurt the center." Simon's expression softened as he saw the determination in Layla's eyes. "I thought you might say that," he said. "Bradley's ready to help. He can make sure this information gets to the right people. City officials, journalists, anyone who can hold Lucas accountable." Layla nodded, her fingers tightening around the edges of the folder. "Good. I've let him push people around for too long. If he thinks he can use this place to play his games, he's wrong." Simon leaned against the table, his tone turning cautious. "Are you sure about this?" Once this goes public, there's no turning back. Lucas isn't the type to go quietly. I'm sure, Layla said firmly. He's already trying to use the center as leverage, and I won't stand for it. If exposing him is what it takes to protect what we've built, then that's what I'll do. Simon studied her for a moment before nodding. All right, I'll have Bradley start making calls. Layla exhaled slowly, her mind racing with the implications of what they were about to do. It was a risk, but Lucas had forced her hand. She wouldn't let him jeopardize the community she had worked so hard to nurture. As Simon stepped aside to call Bradley, Layla returned to the kitchen, where Jacob and Julia were still immersed in their activities. Watching them, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This fight wasn't just about the center, it was about safeguarding the life she had built for her children. "Mum, are you okay?" Julia asked, looking up from her poster. Layla smiled, kneeling beside her daughter. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just working on something important." Julia tilted her head. "Is it about the gala?" "Kind of," Layla said gently. "But it's nothing for you to worry about. You and Jacob just focus on having fun today, okay?" Julia nodded, her trust in her mother unwavering. Layla kissed her on the forehead before standing, her resolve strengthening. She had always been their rock, and she wouldn't let anything or anyone shake that foundation. A few hours later, Layla met Simon and Bradley at a quiet cafe, the folder of evidence resting between them on the table. Bradley, his demeanor calm and professional, outlined the plan to leak the documents strategically, ensuring maximum impact while protecting the center from any potential fallout. "Once this gets out, Lucas will be too busy defending himself to bother with you," Bradley said. "But we need to be thorough. If he finds a loophole, he'll exploit it." "I trust you to handle the details," Layla said, her voice steady. "Just make sure it sticks." Simon reached across the table, his hand brushing hers briefly. "We'll make sure of it," he said. "You're not in this alone." For the first time, Layla allowed herself to believe that might be true. The battle with Lucas was far from over, but with Simon and Bradley's support, she felt a glimmer of hope. As they finalized the plan, Layla couldn't help but think of the future, not just for the center, but for her family. Simon's presence had complicated her world in ways she hadn't expected, but it had also given her a sense of partnership she hadn't felt in years. Whatever came next, she knew she was ready to face it. When the meeting ended, Simon walked her to her car. "This is a big step," he said quietly, "but I know you can handle it." Layla met his gaze, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Thanks to you." Simon hesitated for a moment, then said, "I meant what I said before. I'm here for you and the kids, no matter what happens." Layla nodded, the walls she had so carefully built beginning to crack. "I know," she said softly, "and I appreciate it. More than you realize." As she drove home, the weight of the upcoming fight settled over her. But beneath it was a new-found strength, one she hadn't felt in a long time. With Simon by her side and the truth finally coming to light, she knew they had a chance to reclaim control of their lives and their future. The fallout from the leaked documents was swift and decisive. By the end of the week, Lucas Dawson was facing investigations from both city officials and the press, his carefully cultivated image crumbling under the weight of damning evidence. Articles flooded local news outlets, detailing his manipulations and unethical practices, and it wasn't long before his name became synonymous with scandal. For Layla, the victory was bittersweet. The community center was safe, and Lucas no longer posed a threat, but the battle had taken its toll. As she stood outside the center, watching families come and go, she allowed herself a rare moment of quiet reflection. The fight had been worth it, but it had forced her to confront questions she wasn't yet ready to answer. Questions about trust, family, and the future. Simon arrived shortly after, his presence steady and familiar. He approached her with a cautious smile, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this," he said, handing her one. Layla accepted it with a nod of gratitude. "Thanks. I think I've been running on fumes since the gala." "You deserve a break," Simon said, leaning against the railing beside her. "You did it, Layla. The center is secure, and Lucas won't be bothering anyone for a long time." Layla let out a soft laugh, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "It still feels surreal. For so long it was just me fighting to keep this place going. Now, it's like I can finally breathe." Simon's gaze softened. "You're not alone anymore. You've got an entire community behind you, and—" He hesitated, his voice quieter. "You've got me, too, if you'll have me." Layla glanced at him, her defenses lowering for the first time. "Simon," she began, her voice steady but hesitant, "you've been incredible through all of this, and I see how much you care about the kids, but this isn't just about me. It's about them." Simon nodded, understanding. "I know, and I'm not expecting anything overnight. I just want to be here for them, and for you in whatever way you'll let me." Layla looked down at the coffee in her hands, her thoughts racing. Over the past weeks, Simon had proven himself time and again, not just through his actions, but through his unwavering support. She had spent so long protecting herself and her children that she hadn't realized how much she needed someone to share the load. Before she could respond, the door to the center opened, and Jacob and Julia burst out, their laughter filling the air as they ran toward her. "Mum, Mr. Carter said we're going to start a new soccer league," Jacob exclaimed, his excitement infectious. "That's great, sweetheart," Layla said, setting her coffee down to hug them both. Julia glanced at Simon, her shy smile growing as she tugged on his sleeve. "Are you going to watch us play, Mr. Simon?" she asked. Simon crouched to her level, his smile warm. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." Layla watched the exchange, her heart softening as Julia reached for Simon's hand. In that moment, the answer became clear, not just for herself, but for her children. They deserved to know the truth, and they deserved to have people in their lives who cared about them. Later that evening, Layla sat with Simon at the park, watching as Jacob and Julia played on the swings, their laughter carrying across the cool night air. The scene was peaceful, a sharp contrast to the chaos of the past few weeks. For the first time in what felt like forever, Layla allowed herself to relax, to imagine a future that didn't feel so uncertain. "They look happy," Simon said, breaking the silence. His gaze remained fixed on the twins, his expression a mixture of hope and longing. "They are," Layla replied softly, "and I want to keep it that way." Simon turned to her, his voice steady but careful. "I know this hasn't been easy, for any of you, but I meant what I said, Layla. I'm here, no matter what that looks like." She took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You've done more than I ever expected. For the center, for them, for me. And I see the way they look at you, Simon. They're starting to trust you. I can't ignore that anymore." Simon didn't speak, letting her find her own words. Layla continued, her tone resolute but kind. "I'm not ready for everything to change overnight, but they deserve to know who you are. And if you're ready to be a part of their lives, I won't stand in the way." Relief washed over Simon's face, though he tempered it with a nod of understanding. "I'll follow your lead," he said. "Whatever you think is best for them." Layla smiled faintly, a weight lifting from her shoulders. "One step at a time," she said, echoing the mantra that had carried her through the toughest days. As the children ran toward them, their cheeks flushed and their smiles wide, Layla felt a flicker of hope, The path ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to walk it alone. Simon stood, extending a hand to Jacob and Julia. "How about ice cream?" he asked, grinning. "Yes!" Jacob cheered, while Julia grabbed Simon's other hand without hesitation. Layla watched them go, her heart full as she followed behind. Their little family wasn't traditional, and it certainly wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, and it was enough.